is our witness. My name is Parimal, the producer and host, and welcome you all. Today is March 11. Exactly 10 years back, on March 11, 2011, a massive earthquake on the Richter scale 9.0 struck off the coast of Japan, creating a tsunami of catastrophic events and killing thousands. And obviously the devastation that flows from that. How do people in that deal with that situation? How do they use grit and tenacity to deal with that, overcome trauma, and then move forward with their life? That's the topic of today's conversation called Japan 3.11. That's March 11. And we have a very special documented travel photographer, my good friend Mark Edward Harris from Los Angeles, joining us, who's going to talk about his inspiring work and what he witnessed there in the aftermath with his images and his stories. So Mark, with that, welcome to Earth as Our Witness.
Thank you, Parimal, to have me again. It's or having me again. It's always an honor to be on. Last time was with our great friend Art Wolf, who actually plays a bit of a role in this whole scenario, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So if you want me to launch into the images, I'm
actually
glad to
before that, before you start, sharing your work, I do want to. You use the word again, which reminds me.
Yeah.
What do you mean by again? Because we had you talk about your really beautiful work and black and white work. It's called The Way of the Japanese Bath. And for everyone who's tuning in, do check out our conversation with Mark about 6 months back, in which he talked about the way of the Japanese bath and also North Korea. And I bring this up. It's interesting because it's the second body of work, that Mark has done in Japan, if you will, and many more too. And clearly, Mark, you have a connection with Japan. So tell us a bit about, Way of the Japanese Bath. It's a beautiful book. I have it. Thanks for gifting it to me. And your connection with Japan. So there's something special that you have with Japan before you launch into your today's topic.
Yeah. Well, actually, you still owe me $55 for it. It wasn't meant as a gift, but I will. At this point, I guess I'm guilted into giving it to you. But my connection goes way back, and I really do think growing up in San Francisco and being exposed to Asian culture as a little kid must have played into it, because I would go down to the Palace Hotel where my dad was working for KCBS radio, and we would go out for lunch in Chinatown. We would go to Golden Gate Park and go to the Japanese pavilion there, and had the tea ceremony there. I think I was an Asiaphile before I could possibly pronounce the word. And then later on, my first time in Japan was probably in my 30s, but I completely fell in love with it. I have done martial arts for a long time and all that. So I was already doing a lot of things that are sort of Asian inspired. Ooh. And then started actively studying Japanese. My ex-wife, who's still my best friend, but her job opportunities were back in Japan, and she's a tea master there now. So anybody who wants to, if they go to Japan and want to do the tea ceremony, I highly recommend. We can connect you guys. And I'm thrilled, and for my photoshops, my workshops over there, we do we go and visit the tea ceremony, photograph that. But so I have a long connection. Now, in terms of the way the Japanese bath, it's interesting you bring that up, because there's a very direct parallel between the Japanese bath and the tsunami. 10% of all geothermal activity takes place under Japan. We are, of course, both on a ring of fire, you in Washington State, me in California, but they really specialize, unfortunately, in earthquakes. That's the if you have the yin and yang, that's the dark side. The light side are the hot springs. And so the same forces that create these magical hot springs and Mount Fuji and all that, and Washington State, you have the magnificent volcanoes. They're all one and the same. And so even though I've been focusing on, the positive things of the way the Japanese bath, and that book you have is actually the 3rd edition. When the tsunami hit, I wanted to get over there and document that, I felt a responsibility to be there. And so what we're going to see today has been published in Vanity Fair, been used by Coastal Care, which is Olaf Hermes, the Hermes group. They used images, and then lately Civil Beat out of Hawaii. I did a brand new story for the 10-year anniversary. So if anybody wants to read more in depth about what we're talking about, they can easily Google me and find these stories. But art plays a role in it, and I don't think he realizes that particularly because, well, first of all, I'll take you back to when I was in Tohoku in November, December 2010. So 4 months before the catastrophic earthquake and then ensuing tsunami. And so this is a view in a place called Jodogohama on the northeast coast of Honshu, the main island of Japan. I mean, what a beautiful, quiet view from a ryokan. A ryokan is a Japanese style inn. And it's hard to believe that just 4 months later, this same ryokan was turned into a evacuation center where people all of a sudden, they were not in a formal kimono and people weren't walking around in yukatas, but, Western clothing, and piles of food was being shipped in for all these people that had lost their homes down below. But after this, I was back in the States, and then I got a job to shoot on March 11th in Hawaii. I'm sorry, in Canada, for all reasons, to do an outreach program for Coca-Cola. So I was with the World Wildlife Foundation headquarters, I think in Toronto. And then I woke up to the news of what had happened just off this coast. And so we're looking at that same view in 2010, but 43 miles or so off this coast, right from exactly here, was the epicenter of the earthquake. And because of the way the tectonic plates are, and I'm no expert in those, but basically it was a perfect storm because it was far enough away to generate these huge waves that overwhelmed the coastal defenses. And Japan is so well equipped for earthquakes in terms of the structures. And so very few people, and of course, anybody dying is terrible, but very few people, relatively few people died in a 9.0, 9.1 earthquake. But the water overwhelmed, the ocean overwhelmed the existing seawalls. But after Canada, I was scheduled to go with art to China, and I don't think you realize that. And so, which I did. I had an assignment to document one of his workshops there, which I did. But so immediately I went there, and then immediately from there went to Japan to document the destruction. And while I was there, still in November, December 2010, I did notice, like walking from the beach to Jodogohama, the evacuation signs. And you don't have to read kanji, Japanese writing to understand that this is obviously an evacuation route. And so I've always been fascinated by tsunamis. I was actually, with my family, evacuated, believe it or not, in 1964 when we were living in Tiburon, just north of San Francisco, because of the Alaska earthquake. We had to, and it's really unnecessary if you think about where we lived in Tiburon, but nobody really knew about anything. And so we evacuated to a hospital parking lot and spent the night. And so here's a little kid. My parents are trying to explain what a tsunami was. And I was fascinated by the concept of it. And visiting Hawaii, I saw that was in 1947, 48, they had a devastating tsunami, and that many children died because what happens is the water first goes out and reveals, seashells and all sorts of other stuff, fish flopping around. And a lot of school kids went out in the naivete with, the teachers, and then the water rushes back in. Same thing happened in Thailand. And I covered that as well, the recovery efforts. And so when I saw something like this, I was reminded of that possibility. And same thing near Sendai. You see these signs everywhere, and it says "Ato," 300 meters. And so what's amazing is a lot of these places, even though they said, okay, basically, get out, till to a certain point, to a certain height, but this tsunami was so large that a lot of the evacuation centers were actually not far enough or not high enough away. And that's one of the very sad things, that people did the right thing that they trained for, but it still wasn't good enough. And so I actually photographed bent signs say, you're now leaving the tsunami area, and it was of no use. So we could sort of look at this just to get a clear idea of what happened and where, and most of the things are in meters, and you, as you know, we weren't quite on top of things many years ago when we tried to switch from feet to meters, and so I did put a couple of the numbers in meters, or in feet rather. But you see where the X is, and that's really the epicenter of where the earthquake was, and so you can see that that's a perfect place for water to build up and start rushing in at basically some places. They say, some waves are the speed of a jet plane. And they started coming in, and I documented the devastation of it.
Wow. And look at this.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And this is Otsuchi, which is a place that I've returned to several times. In fact, in the Vanity Fair story, and then for the 5-year, and then the Civil Beat story for the 10-year, I revisited the same people instead of, I always try to think in terms of a narrative. How do you tell the story? Do you just do this overall story, or do you start really honing in and have a single person or a couple of people tell the bigger story? And so to me, it was obvious that if I could connect with the right people, it would personalize the story, and we could get a better understanding of the bigger picture. And so this ship is named the Hamayuri. And strangely enough, as human nature is, there was sort of a battle between what do we leave the boat as a memorial to the place? Do we remove it? And then they finally decided they would remove it, and we're going to see a picture later.
Can you go back, Mark? Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you go back, this is a really powerful image. Thank you for sharing that, for capturing it so beautifully as well. What was your reaction or feeling when you walked to the scene and you saw this?
Well, I first of all have to thank my friend Yoshi, who works for JTB. So we have worked together on very positive tourism stories. And when the tsunami happened, I connected him with him and said, I'd really like to get over there and document what's going on. At first, because he's got a family, at first he goes, no. And then he very soon afterwards emailed me back and said, yes, it's important. We need to do this. And so he drove us up, and we had to do a very circuitous route because a lot of the roads were closed. There was no public transportation. And so we were in his car, and we'd already passed this area and we're further south. But on the news, because he has TV on his in his car, I saw this picture, this, from a different angle or whatever. And I said, oh, this is unbelievable. This is surreal. Where is it? I do speak some conversational Japanese, but it wasn't good enough to really understand it. So he explained it was Otsuchi. So we turned around and went back, and it was in the morning. And so it was front lit. And so that's fortuitous. And then I climbed up on a seawall because I always astral project. I'm always thinking, instead of just, a lot of people sort of just, they see something and they start shooting from whatever height they happen to be. They see it, they respond, then they go on. I astral projected and thought, okay, if I can climb up on the seawall, I can get to an angle that would be more impactful, and I could tell the story that way. And so I climbed up. Now, strangely enough, I had a 14-24 with me. I had 2 cameras, and I smashed it on the way up. It broke. Ironically, 5 years later, to shoot the same photo, I broke another lens climbing up to the exact same spot. Now, that is bizarre, but wasn't upset. Yeah, it was bizarre. ironic, but of course, like these people lost everything. They lost their lives. And so to break a lens, big deal. And even at that exact moment, I thought about that. I actually remember that thought. But I do remember, because, and Philip Jones Griffiths, a great photographer who did a lot of work in Vietnam, always said, if you end up, babbling, crying, I think the babbling was the word he used, you're no good to anybody. You're not doing a job you're there for. And so even though it was sad or whatever, I stayed focused on the job at hand. And so I go after the same sort of shots that I always discuss when I have workshops and go for an environmental photograph. In other words, and so rather this being a person in an environmental photograph, it's the ship that gives a sense of place. And so I just applied that. And so this one could consider sort of an opening shot. And it has since been published many times and is used as an opening shot.
Also the scale of it compared to the house it's on.
Exactly.
Just the scale of that.
Exactly. It really gives a sense of scale. If I just shot low up at it, which most people did, I think you're missing something. And when you see the before and after shot, I'll show later, you really see that it works because of that. Now here is something else that I use in the workshops where I talk about the waiting for the extra element. What are the odds of being at the right place and at the right time all the time? It's better to shoot less photos and wait for something to happen. Now that doesn't mean at all, if you're doing documentary work, that you say, hey, could you walk through here? That's not documentary work. And so I just climbed up on a pile of rubble and kept the camera down, got my frame beforehand, so I knew what I wanted to shoot and kept the camera down. And then as a car drove by, as somebody on a bike or whatever, and then as gentlemen walking by, I shot the photo, and I was very quick. And fortuitously, and I probably had it on motor drive in this case, he was not merging with the ship, which is the Asia Symphony, which had a Philippine crew, and they all survived, which is fortunate. Obviously, the people in the town, many people didn't. But this extra element really gives, as you mentioned in the last photo, a sense of scale. And so I think this really, but also it says more about the Japanese people as well. And it was so incredibly inspiring. Here's a gentleman dressed up in a suit and tie and a mask because of all the debris. And he's walking as if he's walking to work on a regular day. But I don't even know where he possibly could have been walking, because I didn't see anything that was in existence where one could work. But we had no conversation, no interaction. As far as I remember, I don't know if we said hello or not, but it was symbolic.
It's obviously a very tragic image, of a tragic event. But even the lines here, very powerful lines. If you look at all the leading lines of the ship, the seawall, the cable or the power cables at the top, it's just very interesting the way you've composed that.
Right, and so what you do is when you really stop and think. Don't shoot like a mitraillette, which I remember Willie Ronis used that word, shoot like a machine gunner. If you really stop and think, I think you get stronger images. There's definitely times when you shoot on the fly, and it's more important, of course, to capture the image than to get nothing and then come back with an excuse, which an editor at National Geographic said, we publish pictures, not excuses. And so you really do have to go by that. So get the image, but you can have the camera set for the the usual like Associated Press concept of F1 250 F8 and be there. In other words, you can have your technical things down, so when something arises, you're ready to go. And here's something where I purposely pulled more depth of field, and this is near Sendai. And it's almost like something like from The Wizard of Oz, in Oklahoma, just endless destruction. But this is 100% real, but using somewhat of a wide angle lens and lots of depth of field conveyed that better. And so I am always thinking technically at the same time. But and that only because when you're doing it as a profession, you're doing it a lot. You're able to think very quickly. It's almost you still can be in a moment, but you're processing the information very quickly. Okay, I want a lot of depth of field. So you get a feel for the whole thing. What do you want to cut off? What do you want to include? And so this was probably, I could look at the metadata, but probably F16, F22.
Very powerful image. Again, this is yet another very powerful image, and I completely can see your storytelling in this. How do you prepare, Mark, or how do you keep objectively sane when something as disturbing happens, and you are there to witness it? How do you draw the right balance of feeling what you're feeling and at the same time doing your job?
Well, I think first, you're always a human first, no matter what you are. Second, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a photographer, whether you're whatever, you're a human first. Let's say for some reason somebody was drowning still in this situation, I would immediately help them, put the camera down and help them. So I consider my job is to be a human first, but photography is in me, as if, let's say, like Picasso was a painter 24 hours a day. I'm not comparing myself to Picasso, but just saying he was a painter, and that he didn't put down his brushes at 6 o'clock and say, now I'm whatever else. So I'm a photographer around the clock, but I'm also a human around the clock. And so if the choice is between saving somebody or taking a picture, I'm going to save them. Now, and actually that's happened 4 times, actually, but that's another story. But the situation like this, it's sad, but it's not like a war zone sad. War zone, there's hatred and people trying to kill each other. Here, you really felt this mass sense of people trying to help each other. And so that's very inspiring. That's a very different feel than a negativity you can get. Now, you might say, like, if you're on one side or the other in a war zone, then there's a camaraderie and all that. But there were no negatives in terms, later on, there were some issues with, were some people getting enough help, or the insurance claims, things like that. But that's minor compared. Now this, once again, to use the terms I've used in one of my books, which is on the photo essay, I consider this a natural frame. Photography is 2D, right? It's a 2D medium. So, and you, of course, with your work are involved with all sorts of visuals and all sorts of things. So how that works. But how do you tell? How do you give people a sense of 3 dimensions in a 2D medium? And one way to do that is by using a natural frame. And so, of course, I could have moved to the right and avoided the frame of this, but I felt it was worth doing that to really give people a sense of the devastation and what was left behind. And so a natural frame, I think, works in this sense.
If I can just, on the previous slide, and actually many of these images, if you go back one sec, Mark, there is a certain level of the way you've composed, and I'm saying this as at least an observation from my point of view, but also as a compliment, is that the composition has some level of unease to it, because that's what the subject is too, right? It's not a very pleasant. Right. It's not a very pleasant scene. So does that affect how you compose the shot to convey that feeling of, something that's beautiful and pleasing is very different than something that's surreal, disturbing, unease? And is that something that goes through your mind when you decide how to compose?
Well, you might, in a situation where, if you want to purposely create a visual tension, you could do the old technique, of a Dutch angle. In other words, skew the angle aside, and that creates more of a visual tension. I remember on Alfred Eisenstadt's, for our audience who knows Alfred Eisenstadt, the Life magazine photographer who did a picture of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square, and many photo essays, right? So Mary Ellen Mark and I went to his 95th birthday at the Time Life building. And she said, Mark, I cannot believe that I showed up here without my camera. She goes, can
Mm,
I borrow, a camera body and a lens for a few shots? I said, yeah, which one do you want? She goes, I'll take a 28. So it was a fixed 28 on, could have been an FM2. I don't know if we had an F3s then, I can't remember. But she did a Dutch angle because
mm,
we were in a very boring, for lack of a better word, conference room. But
mm,
she created a visual tension by doing that Dutch angle,
mm.
which really was impressive. And then I did a photo of her kissing Izzy, and I
Oh,
did
wow.
it in a straightforward shot. And so mine was, about timing and the subject, but she shot a shot of me with Izzy as well, and it's a really interesting image. And I learned a lot at that moment about how you could create visual tension. I mean, like that Alfred Hitchcock sort of visual tension with the
Yeah.
Dutch angle. But here, I don't think we needed that. My key concern here was that the pieces of metal in the foreground that are out of focus did not merge with anything, with the car that was the subject matter,
Mm,
and it sort of lines leading you into that. And so that was my bigger
yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
photographic concern. And also, I felt that the shallower depth of field, we did not need to see all this, stuff in the foreground sharp. There's no
Yeah.
need for that. That
Yeah.
that we could use shallow depth of field here, so we could focus on really what was the hero of the image. Here is much more of a reportage shot. When you do reportage, you shoot with whatever um, you have. So it's not necessarily going to be ideal times of day, ideal lighting, or whatever. That's not the point. Maybe you could say because there's sort of this jagged stick directly behind him, that maybe that creates some more visual tension.
Mm,
Uh, that this looks like a 70 to 200 to me, but
it does. Yeah.
along the compression.
The compression of
Uh,
it. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And actually, even then, I might have had my fixed 180 with me at that time.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't have a zoom then. But you could feel the visual tension there, and also a little bit of a respectful distance. Mark Rabu, when he was talking about his photography in Vietnam, did not like to get in people's faces if they were suffering or doing something. And so I respect that. I mean, there's a time for environmental portraits, and if there's some interaction with people, I think that's great. But I do like this bit of respectful distance sort of thing. And this was repeated thousands and thousands of times up and down the coast. People looking. I mean, I have no clue what he was looking for there. If he was looking for somebody he knew, if this was his car. I mean, who knows
Mm,
what it was. Certain times I do ask people. In this particular case, I didn't feel the need to. Now, this was up in a northern part of Tohoku, and a pachinko parlor, which is extremely popular throughout Japan. Pachinko. I've never really understood the game, uh, but people love it. But and you can still see lots and in the trays. There's lots and lots of coins still.
yeah.
So obviously, whatever happened, whether 2:46 p.m. that day and the sirens went off soon afterwards, did everybody just leave the coins run out? Did people stay thinking they were too far in, and then were hit by the tsunami? Um, that's hard to say.
Mm,
What happened to the people that were there? But there were a lot of coins left in there, so obviously people did get out in a
yeah.
hurry. Now there was in this same area a convenience store. They call them in Japan convenies, um, and the people working there refused to leave in a town called Taro, and they were all killed.
Oh my gosh.
But because that is sort of that Japanese ethic too. I'm scheduled to work from 8 to 5, so I'm going to work 8 to 5, and
Mm,
that cost them their lives. I was uh, in the beginning of April, so the beginning of the following month. I was in a hotel in Sendai, and we on the 16th floor, and we were hit by a massive what's called Yoshin, which is an aftershock. It's about 7.1, and it lasted forever. But very soon afterwards, I heard people running up the stairs, and a young woman was knocking on all the doors, telling everybody to evacuate.
Mm.
So, and her job was, she was, working at the front desk. So she was not a professional rescuer or engineer or anything. I did hear engineers going up the steps to check things. And this was a hotel that was already damaged. And when we checked in, they said, we only have cold water. But that's fine. We just needed a place to stay. But the fact that she stayed on the job, ran up to every floor with her coworkers, knocking on the doors to make sure we all got out, was really impressive. And we spent the night in the parking lot under the stars, which I was perfectly happy to do. I had no desire to be back inside a building that night. And actually, then the next night, I think we slept in actually, we went up the coast, so we had to stay at a ryokan inland, which was nice, which is a Japanese style inn with a hot spring. And then we hit the coast, and then we would stay. I had a sleeping bag. Yoshi would sleep in the car. I would sleep in the parking lot in a sleeping bag, and then we would get up at sunrise and then drive to the next town, through a very circuitous route of rubble, and then to the next town, the next town, next town. Now, instead of showing bodies or whatever, I think you can convey the sense of people and the loss without having to do that. I think it's important to document both for sure, but I think there's ways to convey the human connection. And so I thought I would show an image that I think does that. And so here's, Winnie the Pooh. Who knows what happened to the child that had this? Now, the amazing thing is, the one thing that I did see, and I photographed over and over again in different scenarios, were stuffed animals that evidently float extremely well. There were hundreds and hundreds of stuffed animals everywhere, which was very bizarre. Hardly any sound of birds, hardly any sound of anything else. There were some people coming back to try to find where the homes were and to try to find a photo album or something else. And then there were rescue teams. But other than that, you would see these stuffed animals everywhere.
It is even the Winnie the Pooh. It's a powerful image. It's a disturbing image. It's a sad image, obviously.
Yeah.
It almost to me conveys in one shot. If you can go back for a second,
Sure.
The lost childhood or the lost child. We just don't know. Is it the lost child
No
or
clue.
the lost childhood? Hopefully, the child survived, but the childhood is still questionable because maybe the home is gone. The trauma of that.
Well, very good. There's towns I went to, Ritsuzen, Takata, Kisanuma, Otsuchi, Miyako, Taro. All these places were just devastated. Otsuchi lost 10% of their population of 16,000 people. 10%. And of course, I interviewed some of the people who had lost family that we'll see later. So there really is no way to know specifics about some of these situations and some of the things that were found by people. And there were people who later on went out and sorted photos and collected them. And when they saw a name, would file them. And so a lot of, and the people that were out searching for people would pile up photo albums and other mementos for the people. There's also a very famous video that I would recommend for your viewers, for our viewers to watch. There's two of them actually. Is one dog near Sendai protecting another dog that they had been out for days, and nobody's 100% sure of the story of what happened to them. There's another one of the Coast Guard. There's a house floating off the coast, and this one is really inspiring because we know it's a positive ending. A Coast Guard helicopter out at sea, trying to lower some rescuers onto a house's roof that had floated out to sea. And a dog was underneath, but every time the people would come down, the dog would hide underneath the house so they couldn't get to it. So they finally had to leave, but they called a Coast Guard cutter that came out and rescued the dog. I mean, and that is really something to make that effort.
Yeah.
Out at sea, that dog would not have survived. It had been out for days. They were able to get the dog, and then they brought the dog to a rescue center. And then you see the woman pull into the rescue center and is reunited with the dog, and the dog is just out of control,
Yeah.
kissing its
Oh,
owner, the love of it, and that sort of show of emotion is very un-Japanese sort of thing. And so the woman's
yeah.
sort of embarrassed or whatever, but the dog wasn't, and it was just such a beautiful scene. So I would highly recommend for our viewers to see that.
Thank you.
But this is the sad reality of the situation, right? You have now the estimates are over 15,000 people dead, 5,000 missing. Well, 10 years later, you can pretty much guess what happened to the missing people. So often the number is set around 20,000 people were lost in this. Fortunately, though, the numbers were not much higher because they do have a great evacuation system where the sirens go off immediately. I mean, everybody knew when the sirens go off, head to higher ground, but they have practice sessions. And so the people did make their way as fast as they could to higher ground. Now, a lot of Japanese people don't drive, and older people especially. And so you see in some videos, some people trying to make their way toward it, and they didn't get there. But here's a volunteer from the southern part of Japan with two of her dogs searching for bodies. This had turned to, when I did this photo, it had turned into a cadaver search at that point. But actually, I think the day after, they found a cat that was still alive in another area. The police that had stopped us one night, maybe it was Kesanuma, had said they just had found a cat that was still alive. But this is Takuya Ueno, who I met in Otsuchi. And he was lighting a candle and incense for his father, who's in the photograph on the the display there, with the oranges and such. His father died on 3/11. They did not discover him for almost a month. And the unbelievable thing is, I happened to be at the tire store where they found his father's body. And I did not know him at the time. I did not meet him until 5 years later. And this photo is 5 years later. But I happened to be at that tire store the same day that they found his father, which is, how is that possible? I mean, that is a very strange coincidence. And so when his wife, Mia, was telling me that story, and she started describing the tire store that looked like sort of almost like a Pep Boys, I looked at my metadata to see the exact date that I shot that photo, and it was the same day. But this is living, after 5 years, they were still living in a temporary home that, were trucked in. They always have these, the Japanese are very well prepared. They have these mobile homes ready to go. But he didn't know where his dad was. He was up in Miyako at a job an hour north. And when the tsunami hit, he knew instinctively to run for the hills. Tried to call his parents, but all cell phone service was dead. And so he, after 2 days, made his way down the coast. He finally there's enough, once again, a circuitous route up through the mountains and down and around to drive, because the coastal route was not a possibility. And he got back and he went to the place where he knew his parents, if they had survived, would evacuate to. The house was gone, but then he saw his mother at this evacuation center, and she told the story that she had been at a hospital. The father had dropped her off with her brother at a hospital for a health check, ironically enough, that day. And so when the tsunami came in, they made it to the rooftop of the hospital, but never heard from the father. And when they found the father, a month later, there really is no way to really know what he was doing. Was he heading back to the hospital, try to pick him up? Was he, in a traffic jam trying to get to higher ground? One will never know. That's not a possibility. And so this is what they do. And now they live, and the mother-in-law lives in another prefab house, but now they were able to get, a couple of years ago, their own house and they also had a son, and it's a much happier situation now for sure. Where now, and his wife, ironically enough, was is Japanese, but a volunteer. She was a volunteer in Japan. I'm sorry, in Vietnam when the tsunami hit. She saw it on the news, rushed back to Japan as a volunteer and a nurse. She's a trained nurse, and helped the people there, and met Takuya, and they ended up getting married. So that's a very good, very happy ending. Now this grave marker is up in a cemetery where many people evacuated to. And when you see, and you can Google and find on YouTube a video of people in the cemetery begging people to hurry up as they see the water coming in. But these multi-generational family, the women of it did not survive.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so all five of them are either dead or missing. And of course, once again, yeah, we can assume what missing means. The text on a tombstone, my friend Sachiko translated for me. It says, first of all, the Great East Japan earthquake. Under the portraits, it says, 1 deceased, 4 missing. On the bottom left in the white letters, it says, where have you gone? We won't forget you forever. And the bottom right in white letters says about 15,800 people deceased, about 2,600 people missing. And then finally on the gray stone, describing our thoughts, smile, appreciation, compassion. And so there's the translation of that. And I can read hiragana and katakana, the phonetic writing. Kanji, I can read some of it, but not enough to really get that.
Thanks for sharing, Mark.
Yeah, I thought that was important. I wanted to share that with you guys. It brings the human element home. Now, this is that same cemetery, and this is where the people were escaping to. I mean, this is incredible. This really shows you, life and death were really measured in inches. There, if you could just make it, or you could just not make it, depending on where you were when the waves finally caught up to you. But the people who made it to this cemetery were safe. But what they witnessed from this exact view 5 years earlier is almost beyond imagination. But then 5 years later, you could see the construction here. And a lot of these places, the construction really was to clear the buildings and to raise the town height, which was a very important element of it. So they did a couple of things. One is they built stronger, wider, taller tsunami walls. 2 is they raised the ground. So they took millions of pounds of earth from the surrounding mountains to literally raise the altitude of the town. So they're trying very hard to not have another one of these catastrophic events. Now, Japan's history, of course, has been filled with, you had the Tokyo earthquake in the 1920s. That one of the few buildings that survived was a one that was built by Frank Lloyd Wright. The hotel there, was it the Imperial Hotel, or probably one of the viewers might be able to write that. Was it called the Imperial Hotel or the Palace Hotel? But either way, that survived. Now it's actually, the hotel's still there, but in a different form. It was made of brick, and they decided to modernize it. And so it was.
Did you say, Mark, I just want to ask you a question here, maybe actually a couple.
Sure.
Did I hear you right when you said sometimes the difference between life and death is just a few inches? And if that's
definitely.
what you mean by that?
A few feet. In other words, just imagine people running up this hill as the water was coming in and almost reaching the top of this hill. That's how high this water came. And this water was not just clean water, but just imagine all the buildings, because the scene we're looking at was full of houses and buildings. The cement structure survived, but all the wooden ones disappeared. So that became this huge moving mass of wood and metal and nails and everything else, people, everything. And so it swallowed you up. So the thought of just this big water, like a lake, and you swimming out of it to safety just wasn't going to happen. And so this would swallow you up.
It's
It would hit
difficult.
you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing visually, because it's difficult to visualize unless one has been through it. For what it actually means.
Well, the height of it is beyond belief. But if you can imagine this scene, but right up to where the dirt is at the end of the cemetery, that's where the water was. A
Wow.
tsunami, a lot of people think of a tsunami as just one big wave and that's it, or maybe two big waves. But that's not really the case in a lot of tsunamis. It really is the whole ocean rising up. And so then you just have this incredible inundation. In fact, in the Sendai photo, not sure if I mentioned it, but the water traveled up to 6 miles inland, which is
Wow.
incredible. But this is Japan too, and so this is this incredible building effort that got started. There is a lot of red tape, unfortunately. And I love Japan. No, there's very few people I think who love Japan more than me. It can be frustrating in terms of so myopic in terms of decision making sometimes, but that's what works. That's why trains are always on time, and things are built well as well. So there's two sides to it. Just like with the coronavirus, they just started basically this month with giving vaccines. Whereas the United States had started a while ago. England, obviously, it started a while ago, but there was a lot of red tape to go through for Japanese to get vaccines, and that sort of plays into a project I will be doing, because I'll be shooting the Olympics, and now they're saying about no fans, this sort of thing, or even Japanese fans, though depending on when they started, maybe they could have gotten everybody vaccinated, but they have their ways of doing things. It's not for me to say. So right here, I mean, this is very impressive. This wall is now pretty much complete. But it was an interesting graphic as well to see it.
It is a graphic of the human spirit in some ways of moving forward, learning from it,
sure.
seeing what you can change and then moving forward.
Right. And you can see this. I mean, look at this incredible tsunami wall. Before, the walls were much thinner, and even if they were the same height, and the tsunami walls didn't really break because of not being thick enough necessarily, but the water what came over them. They were that high. There was one town where the mayor, and everybody thought this mayor was crazy, built extremely high tsunami walls, and that town was completely saved. And that's a rarity. But they really are making an effort by raising the all the town heights all along the way, or at least most of them, and building these incredibly thick, tall walls. One would hope. But this is a shot that I alluded to earlier, that before and after shot, and that same building that you can see in the distance is still there, because the owner refused to sell it, refused to do anything with it. He wanted it kept as a memorial, and it's awfully bizarre that. I mean, I could definitely see that as a memorial if the ship were still on it. I think that would be an incredible memorial to the event. And there are, in fact, I was watching the Japanese news yesterday and today, because technically yesterday, is March 11th. That's when they had 2:46 p.m. in Japan. We commemorate it here for obvious reasons. Today is March 11th. So, but. This image. Oh, and I should say, in January of this year, I think they finally took the building down. That's one thing that I don't want to forget to say. But it took 10 years. But they couldn't raise the height of the surrounding land here until this building was gone, or rebuilt. And some areas have been turned into parks. But what I wanted to say about the news this morning is they did show a couple of structures, one in Miyako and then one in Minami Yokuzen Takata, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Two structures that have been left for posterity. Just like in Hiroshima, you see the what they call is it the nuclear dome now?
Yeah.
That's left for posterity, and I think it's important. And one of them is a 4-story building, and then there's a line on it at the very, very, very top showing where the water got up to, and that building's way inland. I mean, it's just unfathomable. But I think this gave a good sense of now and then, because if you look at the ridge mark, and I purposely, when the person who was going to take me around, sort of put a schedule together for me, I said, could I actually be here around 10 a.m.? Because I looked at my metadata when I shot the photo, and it was the same time, 10 a.m. in the morning, different time of year. And so the light's a little bit different, and also it's a little more cloudy day. But basically, I wanted this front lit angle. But if you look at the hill line in the background, you see the same exact hills.
Yeah, you do.
Which is,
Yeah.
it really brings it home.
Surreal, right? Yeah. Yeah.
It's surreal. And so these now and then photos on occasion are really, I think, powerful. This man, Masahiko Haga, I met, and he was cutting down trees that were going to die or had died from seawater infestation. And so it's a very positive photo afterwards. He volunteered to do this. He was a mechanic before this. And so he cut this down, and I guess these hopefully were used for firewood, and then or other things. And then he started with other people, with part of the forestry service, and I believe it was Iwate Prefecture. They started planting trees, and he said during my interview with him, these trees are planted for future generations. I will not be here when these trees are come into being. But he took a lot of pride in that, and that's sort of that Japanese sensibility too. But that's just not a Japanese thing. I remember reading a book about the building of Il Duomo in Florence, and the people that built that, there's a great book about it, absolutely knew that they would not be alive for when that would be finished. It was going to be a 100-year or more project to complete the whole thing. And it really is something about that sort of spiritual dedication, knowing that you're doing something for people that don't even exist.
Yeah.
That's an amazing concept. And actually we had an aftershock while I was interviewing him on the right side, and his eyes sort of glossed over. And I think you can see in his eyes, and that's with a Nikon with a 105 macro, just to get a little technical, very shallow depth of field, but you can really see in his eyes that he's back in time.
He is back in time. You're so right. There's something about the eyes that he's back in time. He's in that zone now.
He's in that zone. And I think, great portraits, and, one of my best friends, Sandro Miller, is an amazing portrait artist, and he constantly gets that out of people. It's unbelievable. And sometimes he'll ask permission to bring people to a certain place in order to evoke that emotion. But this, I think, did it. And I think that 105 and shallow depth of field really helped that as well.
Yeah.
I also, and you mentioned earlier that I was on speaking about North Korea. One of my books is about North Korea. And in Fukushima, which of course is in the news because of the nuclear power site there and the destruction, almost the meltdown of it. I went to a North Korean school in Fukushima that's still in their playground. They, under a big blue tarp, and in my photo essay about this place, because this was for a Korean magazine, South Korean magazine, I did document that, children playing with the tarp in the background. But it's amazing that they're down to 2 students and they still were doing a class, and that's written in Korean, in Hangul. And so I really do like to become a bit of a fly on the wall for this type of thing. And that comes with time. You don't just step in there for 2 seconds, disrupt the thing, say hi, everybody, and start shooting.
It's really cool. I do want to underscore that point you made, is that, again, the spirit of, moving forward, right? What's happened has
Yeah.
happened. You deal with it, and the class continues even with two students.
Which is amazing. Yeah. And of course, yeah, I am, then conscious, that I don't want the teacher's head to merge with the two pictures on the wall.
Yeah, of
So there's still that technical, aspect going on.
course. Yeah.
But definitely that human, that really inspires me. Just like these fishermen. And funny enough, the name of this town was Obama, just like
Mm,
the president.
mm,
And they take pride in that because this was, the earthquake took place, I believe, during Obama's time,
mm.
2011. Yeah. And I used a handheld flash off to the left, just for the technical thing again, to
Yeah.
illuminate them. And this is what I really love shooting, which is an environmental portrait. And they had recently dredged out, if that's the correct word, their fishing vessel. But they were being paid by the government not to fish because this is Fukushima prefecture. And because of the radiation in the water, they could not fish.
Mm, mm, mm.
And just like in Minamata, which is one of our greatest photographic heroes, W. Gene Smith, around Minamata, you could not fish, I think, around Minamata, and a mercury poisoning in the water there for 25 years.
Yeah.
And of course, around Fukushima, who knows how many years it will be till that area would be gone. And I did go into that area twice. And that is really something as well to experience. And Fukushima is still an ongoing issue, to say the least, with the trying to cool the rods. But I do remember, not always the wide shots, the big establishing shots, but sometimes a very quiet photo can say a lot. And I think, this was obviously a pre-tsunami signage,
Mm.
but good fishing Fukushima, and obviously the sign was partially destroyed by
Yeah.
the tsunami. But how ironic, right? So
It is ironic. Yeah.
and it breaks up the bigger pictures too
Yeah.
in a photo essay, which is what I also love to do, tell a story through pictures.
Different view. Yeah.
Yeah, you have that. And this is my closing shot. And I think sort of it makes sense to close the photo essay here. And this is an ongoing thing. I will go back again. I want to photograph the buildings that are now memorials there. But this is in Alaska. And this is flotsam and flotsam. I never know really how to pronounce that word correctly, but let's say flotsam. That floated all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and over 5 years later ended up off the shores of Alaska. And they went out and they did this huge coastal cleanup.
Mm.
And all these things are from Japan that floated across. I mean, is that amazing?
It
I
is
mean, of course,
amazing.
Southern California, we had some stuff. Washington State, I think you guys had a lot of stuff that floated across. But look at these thousands of pounds of items that flew across. And so this mannequin, and I had photographed some of these mannequins in Japan as well, but this mannequin floated all the way across, but it was backlit. And I didn't go up to Alaska. I was up there for a travel story, but the PR person was so good. And she goes, I know you've worked on this tsunami story, and they happen to be doing a coastal cleanup today. Do you want to go shoot? I mean, that's really a great PR person to do that. And I said, yes. And so it wasn't an ideal time of day. And so I used a flash to illuminate this mannequin's head rather than exposing for it and blowing out the background. And so there, once again, there still has to be that type of thinking, clear thinking to get that type of image. And so
Can you go back? Can you go back? I know we are almost at the end of the hour, so we can wrap up soon. I do want to comment on this one. First of all, it's a beautiful image. It's a very powerful image. It's also a very interesting image from, subject to interpretation. And I'm sure everyone will have their own interpretation, but I just love to share what I felt when I saw this image. And I'm going to read out a couple of comments from our viewers for what they felt as well.
Great.
So to me, right, the mannequin with the eyes open, in some ways also humanizes the image. Even though you don't have a living person there, it humanizes that because we connect with the eyes in the end, right? We
That's
connect
for
with the eyes,
sure.
and it actually is a great example of how you can connect even with a mannequin, because the mannequin has eyes.
That's true.
Um, right? It's
That's true.
interesting. The blue sky, the mannequin looking up at the sky, to me symbolizes hope. Because it's a cleanup. It's time to move forward. It is an optimistic image from that perspective.
No.
It's also a great image for something that pays homage or tribute to the many lives lost, because you have all these things that have collected, and it's a cleanup. So it comes full circle in some ways. And I'm going to read our friend and your friend, very good friend, Michelle Valberg,
Oh,
comment, which
hi,
is
Michelle.
full circle, amazing work, Mark. So that's from Michelle to you.
Wow, that's
I
very
just
kind.
love this image, and it's a very poignant image to end the conversation and the talk. So really amazing.
Thank you. And Michelle, I do have to say, she was on your show as well, and I
Yeah,
highly recommend everybody to check that out. She's an amazing photographer, and we've taught classes together, and we'll do more again for sure. And this is
absolutely.
more her neck of the woods. She's up in Canada,
Yeah.
and the northern part of way north uh, of our hemisphere is very interesting place. And it is true, the eyes really are the windows to the soul. And I'm a bit of an animist, which is a Japanese sort of philosophy that there's almost life in everything. And so
There is life in
uh,
everything.
yeah, and I think that, and the flash definitely did help bring that out. And I always do hold it off camera, and so you can see there's a bit of a shadow on the cheek, and so that does give a little bit more of
Yeah. Yeah.
a shape to the face. And I do
There
have
is
other
no, I
stories.
could go on and on with this image. There's a quiet dignity to that image too. It's just a beautiful image. I mean,
Uh,
all your work is really nice, and I got to say, and I do want to end with a question for you, Mark. That's going to tap into a bit of an insight for you that you can share with us. But before that,
Sure.
I do want to once again thank you for not just your work, but also how much care you take for composing the right shot, for telling the right story, where you create a bit of a respectful distance based on the subject. That shows a lot of sensitivity as a photographer. So I want to recognize that.
And I
And
really appreciate you saying that. It also could show fear.
no, and I
No,
get
no,
it.
no, I'm just joking. No, no, in other
Yeah,
words, and actually, it's funny you should say it. In classes, I really try to get all my students, don't sneak. In fact, we were in India actually, in Hyderabad. Or I'm sorry, uh, in the Tiger Reserve, uh, near.
hand of God.
Yes, exactly. Very good. And we were there, and we walked through some villages, and people were hiding with their 70 to 200 behind a telephone pole or something. I said,
Mhm,
no, you put on a 24 to 70 or a wide lens and walk up and introduce yourself, say hi, do something. And
mhm.
that's human to human exchange. That's the
Yeah,
way, don't
yeah.
don't hide. Everybody sees you in that village, and it's, you're treating people like an object if
Object.
you do that. And then the typical excuse in the class is, oh, but I don't want to disturb them or this and that. Well, actually, if anybody's ever been on the other side of a 70 to 200 and somebody's photographing you, that's, I think, more disturbing.
It
Of
is.
course, there is a time for that, for sure, where you just want to capture something that's happening. But
Yeah.
but typically, you want to, uh, I think, an environmental engagement. So I would really encourage people to,
Yeah.
get up
So
close
here's
and
here's my as we wrap this up, Mark. Here's my question on behalf of all our viewers. If there's one thing that you feel you want to say or you want to convey as something that we can all learn from this experience that you just shared with us, in terms of how you move forward with things, how you deal with calamity or trauma, or whatever else you felt, what's the one learning that you want to share with us all?
Well, it's a bit difficult when it comes to this. I can only say what I observed in other people, because for me it was sad, but of course not I didn't have to move on from anything, but I did notice what other people did,
Mhm.
and I would say they volunteered to help out. That was really huge. The people, uh, uh, Mio and her husband, who lost his father, their organization built a fantastic state-of-the-art community center. They're trying to get a new park for their for the kids in the community. The man who was cutting down the ruined trees and building a forest. That's where the salvation is. And I'm not saying that in a religious way at all, because that's not where I come from at all. But from a spiritual way, is you get involved and you try to help others. And really, you're helping yourself when you help others. That's for sure.
Great.
And
Well,
so, I want to thank you, Parimal, for this opportunity on this day. It was today, March 11th, 2011, 10 years ago, that this catastrophic event in human history that knocked the Earth off its axis by a few inches happened. And so we should be prepared as well. And if it does, if and when it happens here, hopefully we'll do the same to try to help out others. That's the best thing to do.
great. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Parimal.
To all of you
Appreciate it.
once again.
And thank you to everybody for joining us.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.